the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Happy New Year to those who didn't see Monday night. Amen. From the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Gospel recorded by St. Matthew in the 2nd chapter. Reading the 2nd verse. Gospel recorded by St. Matthew, 2nd chapter and the 2nd verse. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.
Yes, Lord.
Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.
Yes, Lord.
Today is the day of Epiphany. The word Epiphany means manifestation or revealing. And Epiphany is January the 6th. And we celebrate on this day the manifestation of Jesus to the Gentiles. This manifestation comes in the visit of the Magi to Bethlehem. A magi is a Greek word, is from which we get our English word magic. But these magi weren't magicians. They were astrologers. This was not a word that would have been used at that time, but they were astrologers. They studied the sky, they studied the constellations, and they observed what was happening in the stars. One night, a couple of years ago, they saw something strange taking place in the sky. There was a star that appeared in the sky. Quite an unusual star that isn't part of the normal constellations. The star was unusual, so unusual that they determined that this star must be marking or pointing out a particular place where something unique was happening. So unique was this occurrence that a star was used to point it out. And because this was so unique and so unusual, these magi decided that they needed to travel to where this star was to see what was taking place. Preparing for this journey would take some time because they were not sure how far away the occurrence was happening. They had no idea how far or how long they would need to travel, so they needed to pack enough supplies for themselves and their camels. It would take at least a couple of weeks to gather and secure enough supplies for the journey. And the journey itself took anywhere from a year and a half to 2 years. And we know this by scripture, but I'll explain that next week. But the whole time, the whole year and a half, 2 years, the star guided them. We really don't know much about these magi. We don't know who these men were. It is generally believed that they traveled from somewhere in Persia, which is the land today we call Iraq. This would be a great distance east of Jerusalem. And we don't really know how many that there were. It is assumed that there were 3 because they brought 3 gifts. But 10 men can bring 3 gifts. So we really don't know how many there were. What we do know that they observed the stars, and a great occurrence had happened, and they traveled over a year and a half just to see what it was. And what allowed them to travel was the policy of the Romans. Persia is not in the Roman Empire, but the Romans didn't believe you needed to be a Roman citizen in order to travel through the empire. The Romans believed that people should be able to travel freely throughout the empire to any place that they desired to go, whether they were citizens or not. You've heard the saying, all roads lead to Rome? Well, technically that really wasn't true. Not every road led to Rome, but what it meant was that the Romans had built the finest roads throughout the empire which would facilitate travel. And because they built such great roads, it was easy for you to get to Rome. But not only was it easy to get to Rome, it was possible for you to travel anywhere that you wanted to go. This is why in the 2nd chapter of Acts, you see that there are Jews in Jerusalem from all parts of the world. Jews were not citizens, but the roads of the empire made it easy for them to travel. And the Roman Empire was much different than the way in which we think about country today. There were many different countries that were in the Roman Empire, but there were no barriers between these countries. No one built a wall. There was no fencing between countries. They didn't believe in any of that. They were not threatened by people traveling either through their country or migrating to their country. Certainly, if Rome wanted to build a wall, they could have done that. Rome had the most technically advanced, the best trained, the best prepared, and the best supplied army in the world. They had the best army in the world, and they could have done anything that they wanted to do. But instead of building a wall and hindering travel, the Romans used their army to facilitate travel. They kept the army along the roads to provide some protection to assure some degree of safe travel for anyone along the road. Certainly they couldn't keep every foot of the road safe, but they did provide reasonable protection so that people felt safe in traveling around the empire.
Amen.
Romans felt that using their army for protection was a better use of the army than building barriers to keep people from traveling. And because of this, the church advanced. Best example of this is Paul. Paul was from Tarshish in Syria, but when we meet him, he's living in Jerusalem. He lived in Corinth for more than a year, and we don't know how long he lived in Macedonia. Paul was able to do this because nobody built a wall to keep him out. And aren't we glad that this is the case? It was because nobody built a wall. Nobody was threatened by people from different countries or different regions. It was because the Romans believed that people should be able to travel freely, that the gospel was spread around the world. Aren't we glad about that?
Amen. Amen.
We can praise God that God chose a time wherein there were no walls between countries so that the gospel could be spread. We can praise God for that. This is how the Magi were able to freely travel from Persia to Jerusalem, because the Romans believed that people of any nation should be able to travel freely. This is why it was difficult for me to describe them and to give a title to this sermon. There really wasn't any such thing as aliens in those days. And really, I just don't like that term. Part of the reason that I don't like the term is that As a kid, I used to watch a lot of sci-fi movies on Saturday afternoons. Whenever I hear the term alien, I think of someone from outer space. But you know, people aren't aliens. They're people. And because of the Roman policy, nobody was illegal. Now, I could have called them foreigners. And there's really nothing wrong with that word. It's just not my preference. Instead, I prefer referring to the Magi as strangers. The Pew Bible uses the word strangers more often than it uses the word foreigner. And the stranger is just personal preference. We see that the Magi were not from Jerusalem. They're from another country far away. They are strange to the country of Jerusalem, and the country is strange to them. They are strangers in a distant land. But they will point the way to those of us who should have known. When they arrive in Jerusalem, they inquire around town that somewhere in the area a king has been born, and they ask where they might find him.
Amen.
Notice the words of our text in verse 2. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. There is a new king in Jerusalem, and they have come to worship him. As they ask around town, word reaches Herod. Herod becomes alarmed. Herod was a very ruthless man. He held on to being king or being ruler of the region by ruthlessly eliminating his rivals. His first and main priority was himself. And he didn't care what he had to do or who he had to kill in order to maintain his power. So when he hears that there was another king born in the area, he becomes alarmed. The last thing he wants is a challenge to his power. And he assembles all of the chief priests and scribes, and wait, just let's put a pin here and look closely at verse 4. Notice in verse 4 it says that he assembled all of the chief priests, plural. For those of you who remember Leviticus 16, you should be confused by this. Leviticus refers to the high priest, and in this case, the high priest is the same as the chief priest. And Leviticus tells us that there can only be one high priest, and that the high priest has to be a descendant of Aaron. When one becomes high priest, he is high priest for the rest of his life. And when he dies, his oldest son becomes high priest in his stead. But notice here in verse 4, it says that there are several high priests, plural. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First, Herod had co-opted the religious authorities of that day so that there would be no challenge to his authority. Much later in the Gospel of John, in the 18th chapter, you find a reference to Caiaphas, who John says was the high priest that year. And the reason that Caiaphas was the high priest that year is because instead of it being a succession from the birth of Aaron, Herod, or in the time of Jesus' crucifixion, it was Pilate, Herod chose who would serve as high priest that year. That was his way of controlling the religious authority. And the garments of the high priest were locked away in the palace. And whenever it was time for the priest to perform the duties of the temple, he had to go to the palace to get the priestly garments. This shows just how much the religious authorities had been co-opted by the king. And the second reason is that there have always been religious people in love with and wanting to be close to power. If you remember in the book of Jeremiah, there were prophets of the king who were telling the king everything that he wanted to hear. And Jeremiah stood outside of the temple gates, warning the people not to listen to them. There have always been religious leaders who are more in love with the king than they are with God. The term that is commonly used today is sycophant. If I were back in Detroit, I'd call them suck-ups. But let's stick with sycophants. Let's stick with sycophant for the morning. Sycophant is a servile person who flatters the leader just to remain in power. A sycophant would do anything to be close to power. And there have always been religious sycophants. There's nothing new about that. There have always been persons willing to ignore or to excuse the immorality of the king just to remain close to power. This is why there were several chief priests in Herod's time. He surrounded himself with religious sycophants. When he heard that a new king had been born, he called them together and asked, "Where would he be born?" And they responded, "In Bethlehem of Judea." Now remember, these chief priests, these religious sycophants, were in Jerusalem. The distance between Jerusalem and Bethlehem is about 6 miles. I have actually walked down from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. It takes about 45 minutes if you get a good walking pace. These chief priests, who were just 6 miles away, did not know what was happening in Bethlehem. They did not even know that the Messiah had been born over a year and a half ago. He was born right under their noses, so to speak, and they didn't even know it. They were so busy flattering Herod and trying to stay in power that they didn't realize what had happened just a short distance away. They were too busy trying to maintain power that they didn't even realize a new power had been born. They were so busy with whatever was necessary to maintain their positions that they lost sight of the one who they should serve. And if not for the Magi, strangers who came to town, they wouldn't have even known what was happening around them. It was these strangers who pointed to them the way. These Magi, these strangers who came to town to announce to the religious authorities a new king, had been born to provide a check on their lives. There may not be a star seen today, but that doesn't mean that God isn't still doing unique and wondrous things all around us.
Amen. Amen.
The question is whether we have become either distracted or disinterested to see what God is doing in our lives. We can become distracted by the troubles and pressures of this life. Life will bring its own troubles, its own trials, and no one is exempt from the troubles of life. We can become so distracted, so caught up in the troubles of life that we fail to notice what God is doing.
All right.
This is what happens when we let the troubles of life distract us from what God is doing around us.
Amen.
And when we don't stay connected to God, when we don't make the time each day to worship and center ourselves, when we allow days to pass without sufficient time in prayer because we're caught up and distracted by the troubles of life, we will miss what God is doing all around us.
Amen. Amen.
And worse than being distracted is becoming disinterested.
Jesus.
We become disinterested when we're more concerned about doing our own thing and living our best life than we are no longer concerned about what God desires for our lives.
All right.
And when we're no longer concerned about what God desires in our lives, we'll never know what God is doing all around us.
Amen.
This is what happened in Jerusalem. The religious people, those who profess to be followers of God, were distracted by their pursuit of power, and some were even disinterested to notice that God had done a new thing just a few miles away. They would not have even known it unless strangers from the east had come to alert them. God is still doing unique and wondrous things. Can you see what God is doing? Can you see how God is still making ways for members of this church?
Amen.
Can you see how God is still moving in our lives?
Hallelujah.
You haven't given yourself over to the powers of this world. You will still be able to see God moving, and you won't need magi to come and tell you.
Amen. Amen.
You will be able to see it for yourself.
Amen.
Watch. Be alert. Pray.
Yes.
Seek God every day.
Yes. Yes.
And in seeking God, look to see what God is doing in our lives every day.
Yes. Yes.
Notice even the small things that God does.
Yes, Lord.
God gives strength when we are weak.
Yes.
How God gives comfort when we are both stressed and de-stressed.
Yes.
Notice how God is with us during every doctor's appointment and is even in our hospital rooms.
Yes.
When we are prayerful and alert,
Yes.
we will see what God is doing all around us, and we don't need magi to tell us.
Amen.
Be alert.
Amen.
Watch. Pray.
Yes.
Seek God.
Yes.
And notice all that God is doing around us.
Amen.